His grandmother picked his bride. The Duke refused. Then he saw who she'd chosen. The autumn light filtered through tall windows with a quality peculiar to October afternoons, gilding everything it touched with a warmth that belied the chill creeping through Thornbury Manor's ancient stone walls. Arabella Thornton sat in her customary chair, the small one near the fire but not too near, positioned to be useful without being obtrusive, and read aloud from a novel she privately considered dreadful. The prose was overwrought, the heroine impossibly virtuous, and the villain so thoroughly villainous that he might as well have worn a placard announcing his intentions. But the Dowager Duchess of Thornbury enjoyed such novels, and so Arabella read them with all the expression and feeling she could muster. "Do pause, child. My ears require rest from such passionate declarations." The Dowager's voice cut through the narrative like a blade through butter, precise and utterly commanding despite her 73 years. She sat in the wing-back chair that had been her throne for 4 decades, a slight figure wrapped in black silk and violet shawls, her white hair arranged in a style that had been fashionable during the Regency and would never be surrendered to the whims of modern taste. Arabella closed the book with more relief than she would ever admit. "Shall I ring for tea, Your Grace?" "In a moment. First, tell me, have you noticed anything different about the house today?" This was one of the Dowager's tests. She administered them constantly, small examinations of observation and wit that Arabella had learned to navigate over 3 years of service. She considered the morning's activities, the extra polish on the silver, the fresh flowers in the entrance hall despite the expense of hothouse blooms in October, the particular nervousness of the housekeeper at breakfast. "The household is preparing for an arrival," Arabella said. "Someone important. The green guest chamber has been opened. I saw Mary carrying linens in that direction. And cook has been consulting the account books for a menu that requires French sauces." The Dowager's thin lips curved in what, for her, constituted a smile. "Very good. My grandson arrives this evening." Arabella's heart performed an uncomfortable maneuver in her chest, something between a leap and a plummet. She kept her expression serene through years of practice. "His Grace is coming to Thornbury. He was not expected until Christmas." "He was not. I summoned him." The Dowager's dark eyes, still sharp as a hawk's despite her age, fixed on Arabella with uncomfortable intensity. "I have written to inform him that I have selected his bride and will tolerate no further delays in the matter of the succession. He is 31 years old. It is quite enough." Arabella absorbed this information with the calm demeanour expected of a companion, though her mind raced. She had been present for the parade of young ladies the Dowager had interviewed over the past month, each more accomplished and beautiful than the last. Lady Georgiana Blackmore had been particularly impressive, a diamond of the first water with connections to 3 dukes and a smile that made men walk into doorframes. Surely she was the chosen bride. "That is welcome news, Your Grace," Arabella said, because something was clearly expected. "Is it? You do not look particularly pleased." "I am pleased for whatever brings Your Grace satisfaction." The words were automatic, the sort of empty courtesy that protected her from revealing anything true. The Dowager made a sound that might have been a snort in a less aristocratic woman. "You are the most accomplished liar I have ever employed, child. It is one of your finer qualities." She waved a hand that was mostly bone and sapphire rings. "You may ring for tea now. And Arabella, do wear the blue dress at dinner. The grey makes you look consumptive." Arabella rose to pull the bell cord, grateful for the excuse to turn away. The blue dress was her best indeed, her only truly good garment, a gift from the Dowager last Christmas. She had been saving it for special occasions, of which there were precious few in the life of a companion. Wearing it to witness Sebastian Ashworth, Duke of Thornbury, learn the identity of his future bride seemed a particular form of cruelty, though she could not have explained why. She knew why. She simply refused to examine the knowledge too closely. The afternoon passed in its usual rhythms. Tea, correspondence, a brief walk in the gardens before the light faded entirely, the dowager's afternoon rest, during which Arabella retreated to the library with a book she actually wanted to read. But concentration eluded her. She found herself reading the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a word, her mind persistently circling back to the evening ahead. She had first seen Sebastian Ashworth 3 years ago, on the day she arrived at Thornbury with everything she owned in a single trunk and her pride in tatters. He had been leaving as she entered, a tall figure in a dark coat, striding past her as though she were invisible. She had caught a glimpse of sharp grey eyes, a jaw set in harsh lines, and then he was gone, leaving only the scent of sandalwood and winter air in his wake. In the 3 years since, she had learned to be invisible in earnest. It was safer that way. The Duke visited Thornbury perhaps 4 times a year, staying a week or 2 before returning to his London life, about which Arabella knew nothing and desired to know less. During those visits, she perfected the art of being present without being seen, useful without being noticed, necessary without being acknowledged. And if she sometimes watched him when she thought no one was looking, if she had memorized the way his brow furrowed when he read, the rare sound of his laugh when his grandmother said something particularly outrageous, the surprising gentleness with which he helped the old woman navigate stairs she was too proud to admit had become difficult, well, that was her secret shame. She was invisible, and invisible women were permitted their private foolishness. Miss Thornton? Arabella startled so violently that her book tumbled to the floor. She pressed a hand to her racing heart and looked up to find Sarah, the upstairs maid, regarding her with poorly concealed curiosity. "His Grace's carriage has been spotted on the road. Mrs. Pemberton says we're to gather in the hall." "Yes, of course. Thank you, Sarah." Arabella retrieved her book with hands that trembled slightly and set it aside. She checked her reflection in the darkened window. The grey dress, her second best, would have to serve for now. There was no time to change. And besides, the greeting of the Duke was a formal affair, requiring the entire senior staff. Her role was to stand with the housekeeper and butler, a step behind the dowager, and look appropriately respectful. The entrance hall of Thornbury Manor had been designed to intimidate, and it succeeded admirably. Soaring ceilings arched overhead, supported by columns of grey marble that matched the enormous fireplace dominating the north wall. Portraits of Ashworth ancestors gazed down with expressions suggesting they found the present generation wanting. Even after 3 years, Arabella felt small in this space, acutely aware of her lack of consequence. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, gave Arabella a quick nod as she took her position. The woman had been kind to Arabella from the beginning, treating her with a respect that fell somewhere between servant and family, which was, Arabella supposed, precisely what a companion was. Mr. Davies, the ancient butler, stood ramrod straight despite his 70 years, ready to receive the master of the house with all appropriate ceremony. The dowager descended the stairs with the assistance of her cane and her lady's maid, dressed in her finest black silk, with the Ashworth diamonds at her throat. She looked, Arabella thought, like a general preparing for battle. "He will be difficult," the dowager said to no one in particular. "He always is. But he is my grandson, and I have never lost an argument to him yet." The great doors swung open, admitting a blast of cold October air and the man who had haunted Arabella's thoughts for 3 years. Sebastian Ashworth entered his ancestral home like a storm front crossing the moors, dark, forbidding, crackling with barely suppressed energy. He was taller than Arabella remembered, or perhaps she had simply been trying to forget. His dark hair was windswept from the journey, longer than fashion dictated, curling slightly at his collar in a way that suggested indifference to society's opinions. His face was all sharp angles and hard planes, handsome in a severe way that made one think of cliffs and winter seas. And his eyes, those grey eyes, she had tried so hard not to catalogue, swept the hall with an expression that promised the coming conversation would be unpleasant for everyone involved. "Grandmother." He bent to kiss the dowager's cheek with the mechanical precision of long habit. "You summoned. I have come. I trust this will be brief. You will find, Sebastian, that matters of succession are rarely brief." The dowager's tone could have frozen the Thames. "But we shall discuss that after you have rested and taken dinner. Mrs. Pemberton has prepared your usual rooms." "I require neither rest nor dinner. I require an explanation for why you have dragged me away from pressing business in London to announce that you have chosen my bride, as though I were a child who cannot select his own wife. If you could select your own wife, I would not need to choose for you. You have had 9 years since reaching your majority, and have produced neither wife nor heir. My patience, such as it is, has ended." Arabella watched this exchange with the fascination of a rabbit watching wolves. The tension between grandmother and grandson was palpable, a living thing that seemed to suck the air from the room. The servants stood frozen in their positions, barely breathing. "I have met every woman of suitable rank in London," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "I have danced at Almack's, attended every tedious ball, endured the machinations of every marriage-minded mamma in England. I have done my duty in every respect save this one, and I will not be commanded in the matter of my own marriage. And yet here you are, answering my command." The silence that followed was so profound that Arabella could hear the fire crackling in the distant drawing-room. Sebastian's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the skin. For a moment, she thought he might turn and walk back out the door he had entered. "I came," he said finally, each word precise as a blade, "because you are my grandmother, and I owe you respect, despite your determination to make that respect impossible. But I will not marry whatever insipid creature you have selected for me. I will not pretend otherwise. You will meet her. You will spend 1 week in her company, 1 week of honest effort, Sebastian, not this wall of ice you present to everyone. And if, at the end of that week, you still refuse, I will cease my matchmaking forever. You have my word." Arabella saw the flicker of surprise in Sebastian's expression, quickly masked. The dowager's word was iron. Everyone knew it. If she promised to cease, she would cease. 1 week, Sebastian said slowly, "and you will accept my decision at its end, whatever that decision may be." "I will, though I think you will find your decision is not what you expect." "Unlikely. I have never met a woman who could hold my interest for a week." His gaze swept the hall again, dismissing everyone present without actually seeing them. His eyes passed over Arabella as though she were a particularly unremarkable piece of furniture. "Have your bride presented?" "At dinner. The sooner this farce begins, the sooner it will end." He strode toward the stairs without waiting for response, taking them 2 at a time with the restless energy of a caged animal. The household exhaled collectively as his footsteps faded down the upper corridor. "Well," the dowager said into the ringing silence, "that went rather as expected. Mrs. Pemberton, dinner at 8. Arabella, attend me in my sitting-room in 1 hour. We have much to discuss." The next hour was the longest of Arabella's life. She changed into the blue dress, as instructed, her fingers clumsy on the buttons, her mind racing through possibilities. The dowager wished to discuss the week ahead, certainly. Perhaps she wanted Arabella to serve as a sort of chaperone for the Duke and his intended. Perhaps she needed help planning entertainments to showcase Lady Georgiana's accomplishments. Perhaps. But Arabella's imagination failed her. She could not guess what the dowager truly intended. At the appointed time, she made her way to the sitting-room, where she had read dreadful novels only hours before. The fire had been built up against the evening chill, and candles had been lit, casting warm pools of light across the familiar furniture. The dowager sat in her usual chair, but she was not alone. Sebastian Ashworth stood by the window, his back to the room, staring out at the darkness beyond. He had changed from his travelling clothes into evening dress, the black coat emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders, his dark hair now tamed into something approaching respectability. He did not turn when Arabella entered. "Ah, there you are!" The dowager gestured to the chair across from her, not Arabella's usual seat, but the one reserved for guests of importance. "Sit, child. We have been waiting for you." "For me, your grace?" Arabella's confusion was genuine. She looked between the dowager and the duke's rigid back, understanding nothing. "Sebastian, do turn around. Glowering at the window helps no one." The duke turned. His grey eyes found Arabella, and for the first time in 3 years he actually saw her. She watched comprehension dawn in his expression, followed rapidly by disbelief, then something that looked very much like fury. "No," he said flatly. "Absolutely not. You have not heard what I have to say. I do not need to hear it. This is your choice. This." His gesture encompassed Arabella, the room, the entire situation. "Her!" Arabella felt the blood drain from her face. She understood with horrible crystalline clarity exactly what the dowager had done. The word "her," spoken with such dismissive incredulity, landed like a physical blow. "Miss Arabella Thornton," the dowager said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "is the bride I have chosen for you. She is intelligent, capable, kind, and of gentle birth. Her father was Viscount Thornton, however poorly he ended. She has served as my companion for 3 years with grace and discretion. She knows this estate as well as you do, better in many ways. She is your companion." Sebastian's voice cut through the dowager's recitation like a knife. "A paid servant. A woman without fortune, without connection, without what precisely?" The dowager's eyes glittered dangerously. "Without beauty? Look at her, Sebastian. Actually look, instead of through her." He looked. Arabella sat frozen beneath his scrutiny, her cheeks burning, her hands clenched in the blue silk of her skirt. She watched his gaze travel over her face, her hair, her figure, and she saw nothing in his expression but cold assessment. She was being evaluated like a horse at market, and she was being found wanting. "This is a joke," he said finally. "Some elaborate manipulation to teach me a lesson about my pride. You cannot possibly expect me to marry. I expect you to give her the week you promised." The dowager's voice cracked like a whip. "1 week, honest effort. You gave your word, Sebastian." "My word was given under the assumption that your choice would be a woman of appropriate standing. Not—" He stopped himself, but the words hung unspoken in the air between them. "Not a poor relation, not a nobody, not her." Arabella rose. Her legs were unsteady, but she would not sit here like a lamb awaiting slaughter. She would not endure another moment of this. "Your Grace." She was proud that her voice did not shake. "I thank you for your kindness over these 3 years, but I cannot accept this position. I must tender my resignation, effective immediately." "You may not resign," the dowager said calmly. "I must insist." "Child." The old woman's voice softened, becoming something almost gentle. "When you arrived at my doorstep 3 years ago, you were a week away from the workhouse. Your father had gambled away everything, your dowry, your home, your future. Your mother was my dearest friend in girlhood, and I could not let her daughter starve. I gave you shelter, employment, dignity. You owe me nothing but your own good sense. But I am asking you, as a dying woman's wish, to give me 1 week." "You are not dying," Sebastian said irritably. "I am 73 years old. I am actively dying with every breath I take. I will not live to see you married if you continue this ridiculous stubbornness, and I will not leave this earth without knowing the succession is secure." The dowager's voice cracked, revealing a vulnerability Arabella had never heard from her. 1 week, Sebastian. 1 week, Arabella, that is all I ask." Arabella looked at the woman who had saved her from ruin. She looked at the man who had just made it clear that marrying her would be an absurdity, a joke, an impossibility. She thought of the workhouse, and the hungry years before the dowager's letter arrived, and the morning 3 years ago when she had walked through Thornbury's doors with nothing but a trunk and a shattered heart. 1 week, she said quietly. "I will."
"Stay 1 week. But, Your Grace, I must tell you this plan cannot succeed. His Grace has made his feelings abundantly clear." "His Grace has made his fears abundantly clear. There is a difference." The dowager waved a dismissive hand. "Now, both of you, go in to dinner. I find I am fatigued and will take a tray in my rooms. You may have this evening to become better acquainted without my interference." "Grandmother," Sebastian began. 1 week. You gave your word. Good night." And with that, she rose and swept from the room, leaving Arabella and Sebastian alone in a silence so thick it could have been carved with a knife. For a long moment, neither spoke. Arabella stared at the fire, unable to look at him, unwilling to see the dismissal in his eyes again. She could hear him breathing, hear the creak of his shoes on the floor as he shifted his weight, but he made no move to leave or speak. "Miss Thornton?" His voice was clipped, formal, utterly devoid of warmth. "I owe you an apology." "You do not." She forced herself to turn, to meet his gaze with what dignity she could muster. "You spoke honestly. I would rather honesty than false courtesy." "What you witnessed was neither honest nor courteous. It was the reaction of a man ambushed by his grandmother's machinations, and you should not have been subjected to it." He ran a hand through his carefully arranged hair, destroying its order. "But let us be clear. This marriage will not take place. I do not know what game my grandmother is playing, but I will not participate in it." "We are in agreement, Your Grace." The words came out steady. Though her heart was cracking into pieces, she would have to collect later, in private. "I have no desire to marry a man who finds the very idea of wedding me absurd." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or discomfort. "I did not mean—" "You said quite enough. I understood perfectly." She moved toward the door, needing to escape before her composure shattered entirely. "If you will excuse me, I find I am not hungry this evening." "Miss Thornton?" She stopped, her hand on the door frame, but did not turn. "My grandmother does nothing without purpose," he said slowly. "She is many things, but frivolous is not among them. I must ask, has she spoken to you about this before? Have you been part of this plan?" The accusation, though quiet, burned like acid. Arabella turned then, her eyes meeting his with a fury that startled them both. "Do you imagine I orchestrated this humiliation for myself? That I spent 3 years making myself invisible in your presence precisely so that I might one day be paraded before you like a prize pig at market and found wanting?" Her voice rose despite her efforts to control it. I had no knowledge of your grandmother's intentions until I walked into this room. I wish to God I had remained in ignorance." She was crying. She could feel the hot tears sliding down her cheeks, and she hated herself for the weakness, hated him for witnessing it, hated the dowager for putting her in this impossible position. "Miss Thornton!" He stepped toward her, his expression shifting into something she could not read. "Good night, Your Grace." She fled before he could speak again, her blue dress rustling as she hurried down the corridor toward the servants' stair, toward the small room under the eaves that was hers alone, toward the only privacy left to her in this house that had never truly been her home. She did not hear him follow. She did not expect him to. In her room, barely more than a closet, really, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out on the kitchen garden, Arabella finally allowed herself to weep properly. She pressed her face into her pillow and sobbed until her throat ached, until she had no tears left, until the candle she had lit guttered and went out, leaving her in darkness. It was not the humiliation that hurt most, though that was bitter enough. It was not even Sebastian's dismissal, though his words had cut deeper than she wanted to admit. It was the hope. For 3 years she had told herself she felt nothing for the Duke beyond the ordinary admiration any woman might feel for a handsome man. She had perfected her invisibility precisely because visibility would mean acknowledging the impossible yearning that rose in her chest whenever he walked into a room. She had convinced herself that her feelings were a schoolgirl's fancy, easily overcome, hardly worth examining. The dowager's announcement had stripped away that comfortable fiction. In the moment when the old woman had named her as Sebastian's intended bride, Arabella had felt something surge in her heart, something wild and foolish and desperately, devastatingly hopeful. For one bright instant, she had imagined what it might be like to be seen by him, wanted by him, loved by him. And then he had spoken, and the hope had died, and now she understood what she should have known all along, that wanting the impossible only made the impossible more painful. She rolled onto her back and stared at the ceiling, invisible in the darkness. Tomorrow she would rise and dress and go about her duties, and begin the long week of pretending that none of this had happened. She would be as invisible as she had ever been, more so, because now invisibility was a mercy rather than a survival strategy. 1 week. She could endure anything for 1 week. Sebastian stood alone in his grandfather's study, his study now, though it never felt that way, and poured himself a generous measure of whiskey. The fire had been laid but not lit, and he made no move to remedy that. The cold suited his mood. He had handled that badly. He knew it even as the words left his mouth, knew that his reaction was disproportionate, knew that he was punishing an innocent woman for his grandmother's sins. But the ambush had caught him utterly off guard, and when Sebastian Ashworth was caught off guard, he attacked. It was, he reflected, grimly, one of his many character flaws, the companion. His grandmother had chosen her companion, not Lady Georgiana with her diamonds and her pedigree, not any of the well-bred young women who had paraded through London's ballrooms in pursuit of his title. A woman without fortune, without connection, without anything to recommend her except what? He tried to recall what he knew of Miss Thornton and found his knowledge embarrassingly thin. She had been at Thornbury for 3 years, a quiet presence at his grandmother's elbow, and he had barely registered her existence. A face glimpsed across the dinner table, a voice reading aloud in the next room, a figure in grey or brown, self-effacing to the point of invisibility. But tonight she had worn blue. The memory surfaced unbidden. Arabella Thornton standing in the sitting-room doorway, the candlelight warming her copper hair to burnished gold, her brown eyes wide with confusion that became understanding, that became devastation. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too irregular.
her figure too generous, her colouring too vivid. But there was something about her face that stayed with him, some quality of expressiveness that made her impossible to look away from once one had actually looked. He had not looked. For 3 years he had deliberately, systematically failed to see her at all. Why? The question nagged at him as he drank his whiskey and stared at the cold fireplace. There was something there, some instinct that had kept his gaze sliding past her, some self-protective mechanism that had rendered her invisible long before she perfected the art herself. And then, tonight, when she had stood before him with tears streaming down her face, asking if he truly thought she had orchestrated her own humiliation, he had wanted to touch her. The realization hit him like a blow to the solar plexus. He had watched her weep and felt something crack open in his chest, some long-sealed door that he had believed rusted shut forever. He had taken a step toward her without conscious decision, his hand rising to what? Wipe away her tears? Cup her trembling chin? Pull her into his arms and... She had fled before he could discover what madness he might have committed. Thank God. Sebastian drained his glass and poured another. His grandmother was a manipulative old witch, and this was exactly the sort of elaborate scheme she would devise to force his hand. She knew him too well. That was the trouble. She knew that he could resist duty and pressure and logical arguments, but she also had perhaps always known that his deepest weakness was not pride or stubbornness. It was loneliness. He had been alone since his parents' death 9 years ago, a young man suddenly burdened with a dukedom and debts, and a grandmother whose grief manifested as iron control. He had retreated into coldness because warmth hurt too much. He had rejected connection because connection led to vulnerability, and vulnerability led to the kind of devastation he had experienced once and sworn never to experience again. Eliza Montfort. Even now the name sent a spike of bitter memory through him. He had been 24, naive despite his title, desperately in love with a woman who had seemed to return his feelings. He had courted her for a season, imagining a future, planning a proposal, and then, 3 days before he intended to declare himself, he had overheard her laughing with her mother about her conquest. Poor besotted fool, she had called him. Did you see his face when I let him hold my hand? He actually believes I might marry him, as though I would shackle myself to a cold fish like Thornbury, when Lord Pembroke has 3 times the fortune, and actually knows how to smile. He had not smiled since. Not genuinely, not with joy. His face had forgotten the shape of happiness. And now his grandmother expected him to open himself to that possibility again, to risk everything on a woman he didn't know, a woman without the social protections that should have prevented Eliza from treating him so cruelly. It was madness. It was impossible. It was... His mind returned traitorously to Arabella Thornton's tear-streaked face, to the fierce dignity with which she had defended herself against his accusations, to the crack in her voice when she said, "I wish to God I had remained in ignorance." She had not known. He was certain of it now. His grandmother had ambushed her as thoroughly as she had ambushed him. And Arabella had been just as horrified, just as wounded, just as what? Sebastian stared into his empty glass and tried to read the answer there. But the crystal reflected only his own face, harsh with shadows, and offered no wisdom at all. 1 week. He had promised his grandmother 1 week of honest effort. He had imagined that promise would require him to endure some simpering debutante's company for a few days, before sending her away with a polite rejection. He had not imagined the quiet woman in blue who had watched him with brown eyes, full of something that looked almost like loss. Sleep, when it finally came, was troubled by dreams he could not quite remember come morning. But he woke with the lingering impression of copper hair spread across a pillow, and a voice saying his name in a way no one had ever said it before. Morning light crept through the tall windows of the breakfast room, with the tentative quality of autumn sunshine, pale gold filtering through clouds that promised rain before nightfall. Arabella had risen before dawn, her sleep fragmented by dreams she preferred not to examine, and had already completed her morning duties before most of the household stirred. She had helped the dowager dress, organized correspondence, and consulted with Mrs. Pemberton about the week's menus, all the ordinary tasks that had structured her days for 3 years. Ordinary tasks performed in extraordinary circumstances. Every footstep in the corridor made her heart stutter. Every distant voice sent her pulse racing with the fear that it might be his. She could not avoid him forever. She knew that. The house was large but not infinite, and her duties required her presence in the family's spaces. But she could delay the inevitable encounter, could arm herself with composure before facing him again. The dowager had other plans. "You will breakfast with Sebastian this morning," the old woman announced, as Arabella finished arranging her correspondence. "I shall take a tray in my rooms. My constitution requires rest." "Your Grace, I hardly think—" "That is the trouble, child. You think entirely too much." The dowager fixed her with those sharp, dark eyes that seemed to see everything. 1 week. You promise me 1 week. That promise requires more than hiding in the servants' quarters and hoping my grandson forgets you exist. I was not hiding. The lie sounded unconvincing even to her own ears. I was attending to my duties. Your duty this week is to be seen, to allow Sebastian to know you as I know you, to demonstrate that you are precisely the woman he needs, whether he has the wit to recognize it or not. The dowager's voice softened almost imperceptibly. I did not choose you to punish him, Arabella. I chose you because you are remarkable, and because I have watched him watch you when he thinks no one notices. Arabella's heart clenched. He does not watch me. He does not see me at all. He sees you. He simply does not know what he is seeing. The dowager waved a dismissive hand. Go. Breakfast. And for heaven's sake, wear something other than grey. You look like a governess in mourning. The breakfast room was empty when Arabella arrived, and she allowed herself a moment of cowardly relief. Perhaps Sebastian had already eaten. Perhaps he had returned to London in the night, his promise to his grandmother be damned. Perhaps the door opened behind her, and every fragile hope shattered. Miss Thornton. His voice was carefully neutral, stripped of the contempt that had coloured it the night before. I did not expect to find you here. She turned, her composure as fragile as spun glass. He stood in the doorway wearing morning clothes that emphasized his height and breadth, his dark hair still damp from washing, his grey eyes unreadable. He looked, she thought with helpless honesty, like something out of her most foolish dreams. The dowager suggested I breakfast here this morning. The words came out steady, a small miracle. If you would prefer privacy, I can... Stay. He crossed to the sideboard, helping himself to eggs and toast with the efficient movements of a man who had learned to serve himself. My grandmother has made her wishes clear. We are to become better acquainted. I imagine hiding in separate rooms would defeat her purpose. Arabella remained standing, uncertain whether to sit, uncertain of everything. Your Grace, about last night, I behaved abominably. He turned to face her, his plate in hand, his expression tightening with something that might have been shame. I have already acknowledged that I owe you an apology. I should have controlled my reaction, regardless of my grandmother's provocation. You were ambushed. We both were. That is no excuse. He gestured to the table. Will you sit? I find it difficult to eat while you stand there looking at me as though I might bite. A startled laugh escaped her before she could prevent it. A small sound, quickly stifled, but it transformed his face in a way she had never witnessed. His eyes widened slightly, and something flickered in their grey depths that made her breath catch. "Forgive me." She moved to her chair, grateful for the excuse to look away from him. "That was inappropriate. It was honest. I prefer honesty to the endless empty courtesies I encounter in London." He sat across from her, farther than strict etiquette required, as though maintaining distance for both their sakes. "My grandmother tells me you have been her companion for 3 years. I confess I have paid shamefully little attention to your presence in that time." "That was rather the point, Your Grace. A good companion is neither seen nor heard unless required. And yet my grandmother sees you. She knows you well enough to consider you suitable as a duchess." His tone held genuine curiosity now, the anger of the previous night apparently banked, if not extinguished. "What does she see that I have missed?" The question caught Arabella off guard. She had expected cold politeness, perhaps barely veiled hostility. She had not expected him to actually wonder about her. "I am certain I cannot say what the dowager sees." She focused on her tea, willing her hands not to tremble. "Her Grace has her own counsel, and rarely shares it." "That is not an answer." "It is the only answer I have." She met his gaze then, finding courage in honesty. "I do not know why she chose me. I cannot imagine what qualities she believes I possess that would suit your requirements. I know only that she has been kind to me, and that I owe her a debt I can never repay, and that I promised her 1 week." Sebastian studied her for a long moment, his breakfast forgotten. "You truly did not know, before last night?" "I truly did not know." She set down her teacup with careful precision. "If I had known, I would have fled this house before you arrived. I would have spared us both the humiliation of that scene." "The humiliation was mine, not yours. My grandmother presented you as a suitable bride, and I responded as though she had offered me an insult." He shook his head, a muscle tightening in his jaw. "Whatever my feelings about this situation, you deserve better than to be treated as though your very existence is offensive." "That is surprisingly gracious, Your Grace." "I am not entirely without manners, Miss Thornton, merely without patience for being manipulated." He picked up his fork, then set it down, again apparently unable to commit to eating. "Tell me about yourself. Not the facts my grandmother could recite: your father's title, your reduced circumstances, your years of service. Tell me something true." The request felt like a trap, but his grey eyes held only genuine interest. Arabella considered her words carefully. "I love to read," she said finally. "Not the novels your grandmother prefers. I find them rather overwrought, but histories, and natural philosophy and poetry when I can acquire it. I have memorized most of Shakespeare's sonnets because the library here has a beautiful edition, and I was not certain I would always have access to such things." "You expected to leave?" "I expect nothing, Your Grace. I have learned that expectations lead to disappointment." She took a breath, oddly liberated by the honesty he had requested. "I love the gardens here, particularly in autumn when the leaves turn. I love the sound of rain on the windows when I am warm inside with a book. I love your grandmother's sharp tongue, though I know I should not admit it. She reminds me of my mother, who could devastate a pretentious fool with a single sentence." Something shifted in Sebastian's expression, a softening she had never seen from him before. "Your mother passed away?" "6 years ago, before my father's worst excesses became public. She was spared the scandal, at least." Arabella's voice remained steady through long practice. "I like to believe she would have approved of the path I chose. Service is not shameful, whatever society suggests." "No," he said slowly, "it is not." They ate in silence after that, but but it was a different silence than before, contemplative rather than hostile, almost companionable. Arabella found herself stealing glances at him, noting the way he frowned at his eggs as though they had personally offended him, the way his long fingers wrapped around his teacup, the way early light caught the silver threads just beginning to appear at his temples. He was beautiful, she thought, with the private honesty she allowed herself in unguarded moments, beautiful and wounded and completely beyond her reach, no matter what the dowager intended. "Miss Thornton." He set down his cup and fixed her with an unreadable look. "I should tell you something." Her heart stuttered. "Yes, Your Grace?" "I made a promise to my grandmother that I intended to break. I agreed to 1 week of honest effort, but my plan was to spend that week demonstrating that her choice was impossible, to prove her wrong through the very act of appearing to try." "I see." Arabella kept her voice neutral, though the admission stung more than it should have. Of course he had not intended to give her a genuine chance. Why would he? "I am telling you this because I no longer intend to pursue that course." He met her eyes, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. "You are not what I expected. You are honest and intelligent, and apparently unafraid to speak the truth to a man who has given you every reason to fear his temper. I do not know if my grandmother is right about us, but I know that I owe you more than a performance designed to make you fail. What are you proposing, Your Grace?" "Nothing so formal as a proposal." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "I am proposing that we spend this week as my grandmother intended honestly, that we come to know each other without pretense or agenda, that we see what exists between us, if anything, without the burden of predetermined conclusions." Arabella stared at him, unable to credit what she was hearing. "You are willing to genuinely consider me as a potential wife?" "I am willing to know you. The rest will follow, or it will not." He rose from the table, and she saw tension in the set of his shoulders despite his measured words. "I cannot promise more than that. I have reasons to be wary of such entanglements, but I can promise to try, and I have not made such a promise to any woman in many years." He left before she could formulate a response, his footsteps echoing down the corridor and fading into silence. Arabella sat alone in the breakfast-room for a long time afterward, her tea growing cold, her mind struggling to process what had just occurred. Hope stirred in her chest again, fragile, foolish, impossible to suppress. She tried to crush it as she had crushed it the night before, but this time it refused to die. This time it grew. The storm arrived 3 days later. The intervening time had passed in a strange suspension, each hour weighted with significance that ordinary hours did not possess. True to his word, Sebastian had made genuine efforts to know Arabella, walking with her in the gardens, joining her and the dowager for meals, appearing in the library during her afternoon reading hours, with questions about the books she chose. They talked of philosophy and politics, of estate management and tenant welfare, of poetry and history, and the small observations that made up a life. Arabella discovered that Sebastian's cold demeanour concealed a keen intelligence and an unexpectedly dry wit. He discovered that her quiet reserve masked passionate opinions on nearly every subject, opinions she had learned to suppress, but which emerged when she felt safe enough to voice them. The dowager watched their growing ease with satisfaction she made no effort to hide. "I told you," she said to Arabella on the 3rd morning. "I told you he sees you." "He sees a curiosity," Arabella replied, though her heart suggested otherwise. "A puzzle to be solved during a tedious week in the country. Once the novelty fades. You underestimate yourself. You always have." The dowager's voice carried an edge of frustration. Your father's cruelty left its mark, I know, but his judgment of your worth was meaningless, Arabella. He was a weak man who resented anyone stronger than himself. You were stronger, and he could not bear it.
So he convinced you that you were nothing. The words struck too close to truth. Arabella turned away, blinking back unexpected tears. My grandson has his own wounds, the dowager continued more gently. His own reasons for believing himself unworthy of love. Perhaps you might heal each other if you are brave enough to try. But bravery felt impossible when the storm struck that afternoon, bringing not just rain, but chaos. The messenger arrived soaked to the bone, his horse lathered and trembling, with news that the river had overflowed its banks and flooded several tenant cottages downstream. Families were trapped, belongings destroyed, livestock scattered. The estate steward had broken his leg the previous week, leaving no one to coordinate the response. Sebastian was in the stables before the messenger finished speaking, calling for horses and men, his aristocratic reserve vanishing beneath a commander's decisive authority. Arabella watched him issue orders, organize rescue parties, and prepare to ride out into the teeth of the storm, and made her decision. I am coming with you. He turned, rain already plastering his hair to his forehead, and stared at her as though she had spoken in tongues. Absolutely not. I know these people. I have visited every tenant cottage on this estate, heard their concerns, learned their names. I know which families have elderly members who will need extra care, which have young children who will be terrified, which have skills that might prove useful in a crisis. She stood her ground as the wind howled around them. You need me. I need you safe and dry in the house. Then you will manage without information that might save lives. She met his eyes, refusing to flinch. I am not fragile, Your Grace. I am not some ornamental flower to be protected from unpleasant realities. If you truly wish to know me, know this. I will not stand idle while people I care about suffer. Something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or the beginning of respect. You will stay by my side. You will follow my instructions without argument. And if I tell you to take shelter, you will do so immediately. Agreed. They rode out together into the storm. The hours that followed dissolved into fragments of desperate effort and small triumphs. Arabella directed rescuers to the Miller family's cottage, where old Mrs. Miller had refused to leave without her cats, and then to the Wright homestead, where 3 small children huddled in the loft while water rose around them. She organized temporary shelter in the village church, delegated tasks with quiet efficiency, and somehow found time to comfort a sobbing widow who had lost her entire store of winter provisions to the flood. Sebastian watched her work, and what he saw transformed something fundamental in his understanding. This was no society miss playing at charity. This was a woman who knew how to labor, how to lead, how to put others' needs before her own comfort, without a hint of martyrdom or self-congratulation. She had stripped off her sodden pelisse to wrap around a shivering child, had waded through knee-deep water to retrieve medication for old Mr. Fletcher's aching joints, had held the hand of a dying barn cat so that Mrs. Miller's grandson would not have to witness its last moments alone. She was extraordinary, and he had nearly missed her entirely. By nightfall, the immediate crisis had passed. 23 families had been evacuated to the church, the village hall, and the manor's own servants' quarters. No lives had been lost, though several cottages would require extensive repairs. Sebastian stood in the groundskeeper's cottage, the only structure on the north edge of the estate, still untouched by flooding, and watched rain stream down the windows, while Arabella tended the fire she had insisted on building.
"We cannot return to the main house tonight," he said, voicing what they both already knew. "The bridge is washed out, and the back road has become impassable. We will have to shelter here until morning." "I assumed as much." She did not look up from her task, but he caught the faint tension in her shoulders. "The cottage is well provisioned. Mr. Hartley keeps emergency supplies here for just such occasions." "You knew that?" "I know a great many things about this estate, Your Grace. As I mentioned before." He found himself smiling, despite everything a genuine smile, not the social grimace he deployed in London drawing-rooms. "You saved lives today. You realize that?" "We saved lives. I merely provided information." "You provided far more than information." He moved to stand beside her at the fire, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from the flames, close enough to catch the scent of rain and exertion, and something floral that was simply her. "I watched you, Arabella. I watched you take charge of situations that would have sent most gently bred women into hysterics. I watched you wade through floodwater in your second-best dress to rescue a child's terrified puppy, because you knew that child had lost her father last spring and could not bear another loss." She was still then, her hands frozen above the flames. "You noticed that?" "I noticed everything." His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "I have been noticing everything about you for 3 days, and I find that I cannot stop." "Your Grace." "Sebastian." The name emerged without conscious decision. "After today, I think we have moved past formalities." She rose and turned to face him, and the firelight transformed her rain-dampened features into something luminous. Her copper hair had come loose from its pins, tumbling around her shoulders in damp waves. Her brown eyes held depths he was only beginning to fathom. She looked like a goddess of autumn storms, fierce and beautiful and utterly beyond the pale society misses he had spent years rejecting. "Sebastian." She tested the name as though learning a new language. "I should tell you something." "Yes?" "I have been in love with you for 3 years." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, their ripples spreading outward in ways neither could predict. Sebastian stared at her, his carefully maintained composure cracking at last. "You what?" "I watched you." She did not look away, though her cheeks flushed crimson. "From the shadows, from the corners of rooms, from the invisible places companions are expected to occupy. I watched you argue with your grandmother and yield to her when you thought no one was looking. I watched you slip coins to the footman at Christmas when you believed yourself unobserved. I watched you sit with old Mr. Davies when he was ill, reading to him for hours, though you had affairs in London that could not wait. I watched you, and I fell in love with a man I was certain would never see me." Sebastian's chest ached with an emotion he could not name. "Arabella, you asked for honesty. This is honesty." She took a breath that seemed to cost her everything. "I know that I am not what you would have chosen. I know that your grandmother forced this situation upon us both, and that whatever kindness you have shown me this week may be nothing more than duty. But I cannot spend another moment pretending that my heart is not engaged, that I view this week as an intellectual exercise in compatibility. I love you. I have loved you since you carried Mrs. Pemberton's packages up 3 flights of stairs because her knee was troubling her and you thought no one noticed. I will love you when this week ends and you send me away, as we both know you must." "Must I?" His voice emerged rough, unfamiliar even to his own ears. "You seem very certain of my intentions. I know what is possible and what is not. A duke does not marry a penniless companion. A man like you does not choose a woman like me." "A man like me." He stepped closer,
closing the distance between them until barely a hand's breadth separated their bodies. "Tell me, Arabella, what do you imagine I am like?" "Cold." The word trembled on her lips. "Proud, bound by duty and propriety, too wounded to risk—" "Wounded." He raised his hand, and his fingers brushed her cheek with the delicacy of moth wings. "Yes, that at least is true." She shivered at the contact, but did not pull away. "Sebastian? I loved someone once." The confession emerged from a place he had kept locked for 7 years, a place he had sworn never to open again. Her name was Eliza Montfort. She was beautiful, accomplished, everything a duke is supposed to want. I courted her for a season, planning a future, dreaming of a life together. And then I overheard her laughing with her mother about what a besotted fool I was, how she had never intended to accept me, how she found me cold and dull and impossible to truly want. Arabella's eyes widened with understanding. "Oh, Sebastian." I swore I would never be vulnerable again, never allow another woman close enough to wound me. My grandmother's matchmaking was an annoyance, not a temptation I knew I could resist any woman she chose, because I had made myself incapable of feeling anything at all. He cupped her face in both hands now, marveling at the warmth of her skin, the way her eyes softened with compassion he did not deserve. "And then I saw you standing in that sitting room in your blue dress, and something cracked open in my chest that I had believed sealed forever. I do not understand, nor do I." His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, wiping away a tear he had not realized she was shedding. "I only know that I have spent 3 days watching you, learning you, falling into something I swore I would never feel again. I know that when I saw you wade into that floodwater today, my heart stopped in my chest. I know that standing here with you now, I want things I had convinced myself I was incapable of wanting." "What things?" "You." The word was a surrender. "I want you, Arabella. Not because my grandmother chose you, not because duty demands an heir, not because you are convenient or suitable or appropriate. I want you because you are extraordinary, and brave, and kind, and you see the man I am instead of the duke I am supposed to be." "Sebastian, I cannot promise to be good at this. I have been cold for so long that I may have forgotten how to be warm. I may hurt you without meaning to. I may retreat behind walls when I should be reaching for you. But if you will have me, if you can accept a wounded man who is learning to hope again—" She kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. There was nothing tentative about the way her hands fisted in his wet coat, nothing demure about the sound she made when his arms came around her and pulled her close. 3 years of longing poured out of her in that kiss, and he answered with 7 years of his own hunger and desperation, and the terrifying joy of barriers finally falling. When they broke apart at last, both breathing hard, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers and laughed a real laugh, rusty from disuse but undeniably genuine. "What is amusing?" Arabella demanded, though she was smiling too. "My grandmother. She will be insufferably pleased with herself." "She usually is. She knew." He shook his head in wondering disbelief. "She watched me watching you for 3 years, and she knew before I did. The manipulative old witch. That manipulative old witch is the reason I am in your arms instead of the workhouse. Then I shall have to thank her." He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise rather than a confession. "Tomorrow. Tonight, I find I have other priorities." They did not share a bed that night. Propriety still held some sway, even in exceptional circumstances. But they sat together before the fire until dawn, talking in a way neither had talked to anyone in years.
Sebastian told her about his parents' death, about the guilt he still carried for surviving when they did not. Arabella told him about her father's cruelty, about the years of being told she was too plain, too outspoken, too much of everything no man would want. They found in each other's wounds a strange kind of healing, the recognition that they were not alone in their damage, that their scars might fit together like puzzle pieces long separated. When morning came, they returned to the manor house, changed in ways the household could not fail to notice. Sebastian helped Arabella from her horse with hands that lingered too long, eyes that never left her face. The servants exchanged meaningful glances. The dowager, watching from her window, allowed herself a smile of pure triumph. But their return also brought complications they had not anticipated. A carriage stood in the drive, elegant and expensive, emblazoned with a crest Arabella did not recognize. Sebastian, however, went rigid at the sight. "What is it?" she asked, alarmed by the sudden tension in his frame. "That is the Blackmore crest." His voice had flattened into the aristocratic coldness she had not heard for days. "Lady Georgiana and her mother have arrived." Lady Georgiana Blackmore was everything Arabella was not. She descended from her carriage like a goddess, deigning to visit mortals, tall, slender, impossibly elegant in travelling clothes that likely cost more than Arabella's entire wardrobe. Her hair was the precise shade of gold that society poets waxed rhapsodic about. Her features might have been sculpted by an artist seeking to capture ideal beauty. Her smile, when she turned it on Sebastian, promised delights that would make angels weep with jealousy. "Your Grace." Her voice was honey and music. "How wonderful to see you again. When Mamma heard about the dreadful storm, she insisted we come immediately to see if we might offer assistance." Arabella watched Sebastian's face carefully and saw nothing but polite neutrality. But his hand, she noticed, had released hers as they approached the drive. The absence of his touch felt like a wound. "Lady Georgiana, Lady Blackmore." He inclined his head with formal courtesy. "Your concern is appreciated, though unnecessary. The situation is well in hand. But surely you could use additional support during such a trying time." Lady Blackmore swept forward, her maternal warmth as practiced as her daughter's beauty. "We were visiting friends in the area when we heard the news. It seemed only Christian to offer our services." "You were visiting friends?" Sebastian's tone did not change, but Arabella detected skepticism beneath the words. "How fortunate that your friends reside so close to Thornbury." "Is it not? The Hendersons, you remember them, surely have a charming estate just 20 miles distant. When Lady Henderson mentioned the flooding, I said to Georgiana, 'We must go at once. The Duke will be overwhelmed, and we cannot stand idle while friends suffer.'" Friends. The word hung in the air with deliberate significance. Medicus. Blackmore's smile suggested a closeness that Arabella was increasingly certain did not exist. "You are kind to concern yourself." Sebastian's formality remained impenetrable. "I am certain my grandmother will wish to thank you for your thoughtfulness. However, I should mention—" "Sebastian!" The dowager's voice cut through the awkward tableau like a blade. She stood in the manor's doorway, leaning heavily on her cane, her dark eyes sharp as ever, despite her obvious fatigue. "You have returned at last. I was beginning to worry that you and Miss Thornton had been swept away entirely. We sheltered in the groundskeeper's cottage, grandmother. The bridges were impassable. So I assumed, and I see we have unexpected guests." The dowager's gaze swept over Lady Blackmore and Lady Georgiana with an assessment that left no room for pretense. "How surprising! I was not aware you were in the area, Lady Blackmore." "A spontaneous visit of Christian concern." Lady Blackmore's smile did not waver, though something flickered in her eyes. I could not rest easy knowing Thornbury might require assistance. How very charitable. I am certain Sebastian has informed you that we are managing admirably. The flooding was inconvenient, but not catastrophic, and our tenant families are all safe thanks to my grandson's quick action and Miss Thornton's invaluable assistance. Lady Georgiana's gaze found Arabella for the first time, and her expression shifted from polite disinterest to something sharper. She took in Arabella's dishevelled appearance, the muddied hem, the loosened hair, the unmistakable intimacy of a woman who had spent the night in close quarters with a man, and her beautiful features hardened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Thornton, I do not believe we have been introduced." "Miss Thornton is my companion." The dowager's emphasis was subtle but unmistakable. "She has been invaluable during the crisis. Indeed, I do not know what we would have done without her." "How fortunate that you have such devoted servants." The word landed precisely as intended. Arabella felt the sting of it, felt the reminder of her place in the social hierarchy. She was a companion, a paid employee, regardless of whatever had passed between her and Sebastian in the fire-lit cottage. In Lady Georgiana's world, she was nothing. But Sebastian moved then, a subtle shift of position that placed him closer to Arabella than to the newcomers. "Miss Thornton is rather more than a servant, Lady Georgiana, but I am certain you will come to understand that during your visit." He turned to his grandmother. "I assume our guests will be staying? It would be churlish to send them away after they have travelled so far out of Christian concern." The dowager's irony was palpable. "Lady Blackmore, Lady Georgiana, Mrs. Pemberton will show you to the guest chambers. I hope you will excuse our household's disarray. We have been rather occupied with saving lives." The next hours were torture of the most exquisite variety. Lady Blackmore and Lady Georgiana installed themselves in Thornbury's finest guest chambers with the air of women preparing for a siege. Arabella, dismissed to her own small room to change out of her ruined dress, watched from her window as servants carried in trunk after trunk of luggage, far more than any spontaneous visit of Christian concern would require. They had come prepared to stay. They had come with a purpose. That purpose became abundantly clear at dinner that evening. Arabella had debated whether to appear at all. Her usual practice was to dine separately when guests of consequence were present, but the dowager had been explicit in her instructions. "You will dress in your best, and join us for every meal. I will not have that Blackmore woman believing she can sweep you aside like an inconvenient housemaid." So Arabella wore the blue dress again, the one that had witnessed both her humiliation and her unexpected hope, and descended to the dining-room with her head held high and her heart hammering against her ribs. Sebastian's eyes found her the moment she entered. She saw heat flicker in their grey depths, saw his jaw tighten with something that looked like possessive satisfaction. But Lady Georgiana was speaking to him, her hand on his arm, her golden head tilted at an angle that displayed her swan-like neck to maximum advantage, and he could not move away without causing a scene. Dinner was an elaborate dance of social warfare in which Arabella was hopelessly outmatched. Lady Blackmore dominated the conversation, steering it expertly toward topics that highlighted her daughter's accomplishments and connections. Lady Georgiana had sung for the Prince Regent. Lady Georgiana spoke fluent Italian. Lady Georgiana had been presented at court by a duchess, and had danced twice with the Earl of somewhere important at the most exclusive ball of last season. Against such credentials, Arabella had nothing to offer. She sat in silence, eating little, watching Sebastian navigate the treacherous waters with the skill of long practice. He was unfailingly polite to their guests, but his warmth, the warmth she had glimpsed in the fire-lit cottage, had retreated behind walls she had begun to believe were crumbling. "Miss Thornton," Lady Georgiana's voice cut through Arabella's miserable reverie, I understand you are originally from the north. How charming that you have found such comfortable circumstances despite your family's difficulties." The insult was expertly veiled, wrapped in sweetness that would be impossible to challenge without appearing oversensitive. Arabella felt heat rise to her cheeks. "My family's difficulties taught me the value of hard work and honest service." She met Lady Georgiana's perfect blue eyes with a steadiness she did not feel. Not all of life's lessons are pleasant, but they are lessons nonetheless. How philosophical. I suppose one must find consolation where one can. "Georgiana." Sebastian's voice held a warning that made Lady Blackmore's smile falter. "Miss Thornton requires no consolation. She has earned the respect of everyone in this household through her actions during the crisis actions that demonstrated courage and competence that I would wager exceed any accomplishments displayed in London drawing-rooms." The silence that followed was deafening. Lady Georgiana's porcelain composure cracked for just an instant, revealing something ugly beneath the beauty. Lady Blackmore's eyes narrowed with calculation. The dowager raised her wine-glass. "Well said, Sebastian. Now, shall we discuss something other than Miss Thornton's qualifications? I find myself curious about these friends of yours, Lady Blackmore the Hendersons, I believe you said. I was not aware they had an estate in this area. Indeed, I was not aware they existed at all." The remainder of the meal passed in brittle civility, but the battle lines had been drawn. When the ladies retired to the drawing-room, leaving Sebastian to his port, Lady Blackmore wasted no time pressing her advantage. "My dear Miss Thornton," she began, settling into the chair beside Arabella with predatory grace, "I could not help but notice the particular attention His Grace paid to you this evening. How very interesting. His Grace is kind to everyone in his household, Lady Blackmore. Is he? That has not been my observation over the years. Indeed, his reputation in London is quite the opposite. Cold, they call him. Unapproachable. The Ice Duke, some of the young ladies whisper." Lady Blackmore's smile did not reach her eyes. "And yet here you are, warming him with your presence. One wonders what techniques a humble companion might employ to capture a duke's attention." The implication was unmistakable. Arabella felt cold fury rise in her chest, replacing the embarrassment that had plagued her all evening. "I have employed no techniques, Lady Blackmore. I have simply been myself." How charming, and so effective, apparently. But I wonder, have you considered what will happen when the novelty fades? When His Grace returns to London and the society that is his natural milieu? When he remembers that dukes do not marry companions, however temporarily fascinating they might be? "Mother," Lady Georgiana's voice held warning, "perhaps we should not—" "I am merely trying to save the poor girl from inevitable heartbreak, my dear. It would be cruel to allow her to harbour hopes that cannot possibly be fulfilled." Lady Blackmore's gaze returned to Arabella, sharp as broken glass. "I have known Sebastian Ashworth since he was a boy. I knew his parents, rest their souls, and I can assure you, Miss Thornton, that whatever attentions he has shown you this week, they stem from nothing more than boredom and perhaps a misguided sense of gratitude for your assistance during the crisis. When he returns to himself, to his true self, you will be forgotten as completely as yesterday's newspaper." Arabella rose. Her legs were trembling, but her voice emerged steady. "Thank you for your concern, Lady Blackmore. I shall take your observations under advisement. Now, if you will excuse me, I find myself fatigued from recent events." She walked from the room with as much dignity as she could muster, but once beyond sight of the drawing-room, her composure shattered. She fled to the back staircase, the servant's route she had used for 3 years of invisibility, and climbed toward her small room under the eaves with tears streaming down her face. Lady Blackmore's words echoed in her mind, impossible to silence. Dukes do not marry companions. When the novelty fades, when he returns to himself. She had known this. She had always known this. the fever dream of the groundskeeper's cottage. Sebastian's kisses, his confessions, his talk of wanting her had been exactly that. A fever dream, born of crisis and proximity, and the temporary suspension of reality that came with sheltering from storms. He would return to London. He would remember who he was, and she would be forgotten as completely as yesterday's newspaper. Arabella was so lost in her misery that she did not hear the footsteps behind her until a hand closed around her arm. Arabella. She whirled to find Sebastian standing on the narrow servants' stair, his expression fierce with an emotion she could not identify. He should not be here. This was the servants' domain, off limits to the master of the house, but he seemed utterly unconcerned with propriety. "You left. Why did you leave?" "I was tired. Do not lie to me." His grip on her arm tightened, not painfully but with undeniable urgency. "I saw your face when you walked out of that room. Something happened." "What did they say to you?" "Nothing that was not true." Her voice broke despite her efforts to control it. "Lady Blackmore merely reminded me of certain realities I had allowed myself to forget." "What realities?" "The dukes do not marry companions." The words tore from her throat, raw and bleeding. "That whatever has passed between us this week will be forgotten the moment you return to your true life. That I am a temporary fascination, nothing more, and that I should be grateful for whatever crumbs of attention you have chosen to bestow before you inevitably—" He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was not tender. It was a fierce, consuming possession that stole her breath and shattered her protests and left her clinging to him on the narrow staircase with her back against the wall and his body pressing into hers. "Listen to me." His voice was ragged when he finally released her mouth. "Whatever that woman told you was a lie designed to serve her own purposes. She has been angling for me to marry her daughter since Georgiana came out 3 years ago. She would say anything to destroy what she perceives as competition. But she was not wrong." Arabella was weeping openly now, all pretense of composure abandoned. "I am not suitable. I have nothing to offer, no fortune, no connections, no accomplishments worth naming. You could have anyone, Sebastian. Why would you choose me?" "Because you are the only person in the world who makes me feel alive." His hands cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Because you see me not the title, not the fortune, not the cold exterior I have cultivated for years. You see me, and you love me anyway. Do you think I do not understand how rare that is? Do you think I would throw it away for some society diamond who views me as nothing more than a title to be acquired? But your grandmother, the succession— My grandmother chose you. She is the most formidable strategist I have ever known, and she chose you, Arabella, not because you are suitable by society's standards, but because she knows, as I am beginning to know, that you are exactly what this family needs." He pressed his forehead to hers, his breath warm against her tear-stained cheeks. "Stay, stay, and marry me. Not because my grandmother demands it, not because duty requires it, but because I love you, and I cannot imagine facing the rest of my life without you in it." Arabella stared at him through a blur of tears, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You love me?" "I love you." The words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised her, as though he was only now fully understanding their truth. "I love your sharp mind and your kind heart. I love your copper hair that never stays pinned, and your brown eyes that show every emotion you feel. I love the way you challenge me, and the way you comfort my grandmother, and the way you waded into floodwater to save a child's puppy. I love everything about you, Arabella Thornton, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it. if you will only give me the chance." She kissed him, then kissed him, with all the hope and fear and desperate love that had been building in her chest for 3 years. They stood tangled together on the servants' stair, the Duke of Thornbury, and the companion with nothing to recommend her, and the world outside ceased to matter. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sebastian laughed, that rusty, beautiful sound she had begun to crave. "I believe we are creating a scandal." "Are we?" "2 of the upstairs maids have walked past us in the last 5 minutes. By breakfast, the entire household will know that the Duke was discovered kissing the companion in the servants' stairwell. Should I be concerned?" "You should be prepared." His eyes glittered with something that looked very much like joy. "Because tomorrow I intend to announce our engagement to Lady Blackmore and her daughter over breakfast. Their expressions alone will be worth any scandal that follows." But before breakfast could arrive, before any announcement could be made, a commotion erupted from the guest wing. They heard Lady Blackmore's raised voice, first shrill with outrage in a way that abandoned all pretense of gentility. Then came running footsteps, doors slamming, and finally the dowager's voice cutting through the chaos with imperious authority. Sebastian's expression shifted from warmth to wariness. That does not sound like a minor disturbance. They descended together, abandoning the servants' stair for the main corridors, and found a scene of chaos in the entrance hall. Lady Blackmore stood in the centre of the marble floor, her face mottled with fury, gesturing wildly at a young footman who looked as though he wished the ground would swallow him whole. "Absolute impertinence! How dare you suggest that my daughter, that Lady Georgiana— What is happening here?" Sebastian's voice cut through the hysteria like a blade. The hall fell silent as everyone turned to face the Duke and the woman at his side, their hands still linked, their intimacy unmistakable. The dowager emerged from the drawing-room, leaning heavily on her cane, but radiating satisfaction. "Ah, Sebastian. Good. You should hear this." "Hear what?" "It seems Lady Georgiana has made a rather serious miscalculation." The dowager's smile was serene, as a cat contemplating a trapped mouse. "She was discovered in a compromising position with the youngest Henderson son who, despite his mother's claims to the contrary, arrived at Thornbury this afternoon in pursuit of his beloved. Apparently their friendship is rather more intimate than Lady Blackmore was aware." Lady Blackmore's face went from mottled red to ashen white. "That is a lie. My daughter would never—" "Your daughter is currently in the blue sitting room with young Mr. Henderson, who has just proposed marriage and been accepted." The dowager's satisfaction deepened. "It seems they have been conducting a secret courtship for months, and your insistence on pursuing my grandson drove them to desperate measures. Lady Georgiana was never interested in Sebastian, Lady Blackmore. She was merely too afraid of you to say so." The silence that followed was so complete that Arabella could hear the candles guttering in their sconces. She watched Lady Blackmore's elaborate schemes crumble around her, watched the woman age 10 years in the space of a moment, watched something that might have been shame flicker across her features before pride reasserted itself. "I see." Lady Blackmore's voice emerged flat, stripped of its honeyed pretense. "Then we have overstayed our welcome. Come, Georgiana." She stopped, remembering that her daughter was no longer hers to command. "That is, I shall see to our departure." "Lady Blackmore." Sebastian's voice stopped her mid-turn. "Before you go, you should know that I have asked Miss Thornton to be my wife, and she has accepted. If you encounter anyone in London who questions the suitability of my choice, you may inform them that the Duke of Thornbury knows his own mind and requires no counsel from social climbers with unmarriageable daughters." The blow landed with devastating precision. Lady Blackmore flinched as though struck, then drew herself up with the rigid dignity of a woman who has lost everything but refuses to acknowledge it. I wish you joy, your grace. Miss Thornton. She swept from the hall without another word, her footsteps echoing on the marble until the great doors closed behind her with a sound like finality. The dowager broke the silence with a dry laugh. Well, that was rather more dramatic than I anticipated. You knew. Sebastian's voice held equal parts accusation and admiration. You knew about Lady Georgiana and the Henderson boy. I suspected. Mrs. Henderson and I correspond regularly. We were at school together, you know. She mentioned certain concerns about her son's attachment to an unsuitable young woman. The dowager's eyes glittered with ancient mischief. I may have suggested that she send him here to resolve the situation one way or another. You manipulative, brilliant strategist? Why, yes, Sebastian, I am. The dowager turned her sharp gaze to Arabella, and her expression softened into something approaching tenderness. Did I hear correctly? He has proposed? Yes, your grace. Arabella's voice trembled, but with joy rather than fear. He has. And you have accepted? Willingly, without coercion, of your own free heart? I have. Then my work here is done. The dowager moved forward, and for the first time in Arabella's memory, she embraced another person, a brief, fierce hug that conveyed decades of hope and planning and determination. Welcome to the family, child. You have always belonged here. Now the rest of the world will know it too. That night, Arabella sat in the library she had loved for 3 years, but everything had changed. She was no longer the invisible companion, the woman without consequence, the girl her father had convinced was unworthy of love. She was the future Duchess of Thornbury, chosen by the most formidable woman in England, and loved by a man who had sworn he would never love again. Sebastian found her there, curled in her usual chair with a book she was not reading, and he sank to his knees before her with a vulnerability that made her heart ache. I have not done this properly. He reached into his coat and withdrew a ring, a delicate thing of gold and rubies that caught the firelight like captured stars. This was my mother's. My grandmother has been keeping it for the woman I would eventually marry. She gave it to me an hour ago, along with a lecture about not ruining my one chance at happiness. She lectures you often, I have noticed. She has earned the right. She was right about everything about me, about you, about us. He took her hand, and his fingers trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger. Arabella Thornton, will you marry me? Will you be my Duchess, my partner, my love? Will you help me learn to be the man I should have become years ago? She looked at the ring on her hand, at the man kneeling before her, at the future spreading out like an undiscovered country waiting to be explored. Yes, she said, and the word contained everything all her years of invisibility, all her secret hopes, all her fierce determination to survive and thrive despite every obstacle. Yes, Sebastian, I will. He rose and pulled her into his arms, and they stood together in the firelit library while the autumn wind howled outside, 2 wounded people who had somehow found in each other the courage to hope again. In her sitting-room upstairs, the Dowager Duchess of Thornbury set aside her correspondence and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. 3 years of planning, careful manipulation, and absolute faith in her own judgment, and now her grandson would be happy, her legacy would be secured, and the woman she had come to love like a daughter would have everything she deserved. It was, the Dowager reflected, as she rang for her evening tea, rather exhausting being right all the time. But someone had to do it. The morning after Sebastian's proposal dawned clear and cold, the storm's fury spent at last, leaving behind a world washed clean and glittering with frost. Arabella woke in her small room under the eaves for the last time. She realized with a start that sent her heart racing, and lay watching the pale light creep across the ceiling while she tried to convince herself that the previous night had not been a dream. The ring on her finger caught the first rays of sun, its rubies glowing like embers. She held her hand up, turning it this way and that, marveling at how something so small could carry such weight of meaning. Sebastian's mother had worn this ring. The dowager had kept it for decades, waiting for the right woman, and now it was hers. A knock at her door made her sit up quickly, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. "Yes? Miss Thornton?" Sarah's voice came through the wood, hesitant and excited. "Her Grace requests your presence in her sitting-room at your earliest convenience, and—" A pause waited with significance. "His Grace is asking after you as well. He's been pacing the breakfast-room for the past hour, according to Mr. Davies." Arabella felt a smile spread across her face, impossible to contain. "Please tell her Grace I will attend her shortly, and inform his Grace that pacing is unbecoming in a duke." Sarah's muffled giggle echoed down the corridor as her footsteps retreated. Arabella dressed with more care than she had ever taken in her life. The blue dress was being cleaned after the flood's ravages, so she chose her second best, a soft grey wool that she had always thought made her look washed out, but which Sebastian had once mentioned in passing brought out the warmth in her eyes. She had not known he noticed her eyes. She had not known he noticed anything about her at all. How much she had not known. How much she was still learning. The dowager's sitting-room was warm with firelight and the scent of chocolate, a luxury the old woman reserved for occasions of particular significance. She sat in her usual chair, dressed in her finest morning gown, her white hair arranged with extra care, her dark eyes bright with satisfaction. "Sit, child. We have much to discuss." Arabella took the chair across from her, the guest's chair, she realized, not the companion's seat she had occupied for 3 years. The shift in position felt symbolic, a physical manifestation of everything that had changed. "First," the dowager said, "let me look at you properly." Her sharp gaze travelled over Arabella's face, assessing and approving in equal measure. "You are glowing. I have not seen you glow since you arrived on my doorstep, looking like a drowned cat with the weight of the world on your shoulders. I was rather bedraggled that day. You were terrified, grief-stricken, utterly without hope." The dowager's voice softened with rare gentleness. "I watched you rebuild yourself, Arabella. Day by day, year by year, I watched you find strength you did not know you possessed. I watched you become the woman I always knew you could be. And now my grandson will have the privilege of loving you for the rest of his life." Arabella's eyes stung with tears she refused to shed. "Your Grace." "Augusta." The dowager waved a dismissive hand. "You are to be my granddaughter. I will not have you calling me by my title as though we are strangers." "Augusta." The name felt strange on her tongue, too intimate for the formidable woman who had shaped her life for 3 years. "I do not know how to thank you. For everything, for taking me in, for believing in me, for forcing my stubborn grandson to see what was in front of his face." Augusta's lips curved in a smile that was almost mischievous. "That required no thanks, only patience. Sebastian is intelligent in all things except matters of the heart. He required considerable assistance in that department. You have been planning this for some time, I gather. Since approximately 2 weeks after your arrival, when I watched you handle Lady Pemberton's hysterics over the missing silver with grace, competence, and a sly wit that you immediately suppressed, because you did not yet realize it was safe to be yourself." Augusta leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. "I knew then that you were special. I knew that if Sebastian ever truly saw you, he would be lost. The only challenge was ensuring that he looked." "And the other young ladies?" Lady Georgiana and the others you interviewed? Distractions. Camouflage. I needed Sebastian to believe he was being presented with conventional choices, so that you would seem, by contrast, unconventional. Revolutionary, even. My grandson has always been drawn to revolution, though he pretends otherwise. He needed to feel that choosing you was an act of rebellion rather than submission to my wishes. Arabella stared at the woman who had orchestrated her happiness with the precision of a military campaign. You are terrifying. I am effective. There is a difference. Augusta's smile widened. Now, practical matters. You will need a new wardrobe, obviously. I have already sent word to London for the best modiste to attend us next week. You will need training in the management of multiple households, though I suspect you have already absorbed most of that knowledge during your years of quiet observation. And you will need to learn to carry yourself as a duchess, which may prove the most difficult transition of all. What do you mean? I mean that you have spent your life making yourself invisible, Arabella. First to survive your father's cruelty, then to navigate the awkwardness of your position here. But a duchess cannot be invisible. A duchess must command attention, must lead, must speak with authority on matters that affect hundreds of lives. Augusta's gaze sharpened. You have the capacity for this. I have watched you exercise it during the flood, when you directed rescue efforts with the competence of a general. But you have buried that capacity under layers of self-doubt and protective modesty. Those layers must be stripped away. I do not know if I can. You can. You will. And I will be here to guide you, for as long as God grants me breath. Augusta's voice carried a weight that made Arabella's heart clench. I am not immortal, child, much as I might wish otherwise. I may have a few years left, perhaps more, perhaps less. I intend to spend them ensuring that when I leave this world, I leave my family in capable hands. Augusta, do not weep. I have had a full life, longer than I deserved, and I have seen my grandson find happiness at last. Whatever comes next, I will face it with satisfaction. The dowager reached across and took Arabella's hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of her years. Now, Sebastian has been waiting long enough. Go to him. I believe he has plans for the day that do not include an old woman's lectures. Arabella rose, but at the door she turned back. Why me? Truly. Of all the women in England you might have chosen, because you are the only one who could save him. Augusta's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. My grandson was dying by inches, Arabella, dying of coldness, of isolation, of the walls he had built around his heart. He needed someone who would not be deterred by those walls, someone patient enough to wait, brave enough to persist, loving enough to see the man behind the mask. You are that person. You have always been that person. I merely ensured that you were given the opportunity to prove it. Sebastian was indeed pacing when she found him, though he stopped the moment she appeared in the breakfast-room doorway. He looked as though he had slept little dark shadows beneath his grey eyes, his hair disordered, as though he had been running his hands through it, but his face transformed at the sight of her into something luminous with joy. There you are. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, heedless of the footman stationed by the sideboard. I was beginning to worry my grandmother had changed her mind and spirited you away to some hidden tower. She was lecturing me on the responsibilities of duchessdom. Arabella relaxed into his embrace, marvelling at how natural it felt to be held by him. Apparently, I am to be transformed into a commanding presence who strikes fear into the hearts of society matrons. You already strike fear into the hearts of society matrons. Lady Blackmore nearly fainted when she realized you had won. Sebastian's lips brushed her temple, her cheekbone, the corner of her mouth. I have plans for today. So your grandmother implied, should I be concerned? Deeply. His smile held a warmth that made her breath catch. I intend to show you Thornbury as you have never seen it, not as a companion, confined to the house and gardens, but as its future mistress. I want you to see what will be yours, what will be ours. He took her on horseback across the estate, through lands she had glimpsed from windows but never explored. They rode to the highest point of the moor, and looked out over miles of rolling countryside, purple with heather and gold with autumn bracken. He showed her the tenant farms, introducing her to families she knew by name, but had never officially met families who greeted her not with the wary courtesy reserved for companions, but with genuine warmth and congratulations that brought tears to her eyes. "They know already," she said, as they rode away from the Miller homestead, where old Mrs. Miller had pressed a bundle of dried lavender into her hands with trembling fingers, and whispered blessings in an accent so thick Arabella could barely understand it. "The servants have been talking since last night. By now I imagine half the county knows that the Duke of Thornbury is to marry his grandmother's companion." Sebastian's voice held no trace of concern. "Does that trouble you?" "I thought it might. But when Mrs. Miller hugged me and called me a proper blessing upon this house—" Arabella shook her head, wonder colouring her voice. "These people do not care about my lack of fortune or connections. They care that I waded into the flood to help them. They care that I know their children's names and remember their grandmother's ailments. They care about things that actually matter. They are wiser than London society. Most things are." They stopped at the ruins of an old chapel, its stone walls crumbling but still beautiful, covered in ivy that glowed crimson in the afternoon light. Sebastian helped her dismount and led her through what remained of the doorway into a space open to the sky, where wildflowers grew between ancient flagstones and a single carved angel watched from a broken altar. "My parents were married here," he said quietly. "The family chapel was being renovated, and my mother insisted she would not wait another day. So they came here, just the two of them and a village priest, and exchanged their vows under the open sky." Arabella looked around at the wild, romantic beauty of the place, so different from the formal grandeur of Thornbury Manor, so unexpectedly perfect. "It is lovely. My grandmother calls it impractical and draughty. My mother called it magical." Sebastian took her hands, his grey eyes intent on her face. "I would like to marry you here, Arabella, if you are willing. Not a grand society wedding with hundreds of guests who care nothing for us, but something real, something meaningful, something that is truly ours. Your grandmother will object. My grandmother will be overruled, for perhaps the first time in her life." His lips quirked with amusement. "She has orchestrated everything else. She can allow us this one rebellion." Arabella looked around the ruined chapel, at the angel watching with serene patience, at the autumn sky stretching blue and endless overhead, at the man who had somehow, impossibly, chosen her, and felt something settle in her heart. A rightness, a belonging, a sense that this was exactly where she was meant to be. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Sebastian. Let us be married here." The weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparation and transformation. The modiste arrived from London, a formidable Frenchwoman who took one look at Arabella and declared that she had been criminally underserved by whatever provincial seamstress had been responsible for her previous wardrobe. Fabric swatches multiplied like rabbits across every surface in Arabella's new chambers, proper chambers now, befitting a future duchess, though she still sometimes caught herself returning to her old room under the eaves out of habit. The dowager oversaw everything with the precision of a military commander, drilling Arabella on precedents and protocol, testing her knowledge of the estate's complex financial arrangements, correcting her posture and pronunciation with the relentless perfectionism of a woman who would not accept failure. "You are too modest," Augusta declared during one of their sessions. When someone pays you a compliment, you deflect it. When someone challenges your opinion, you yield too quickly. These are habits that served you well as a companion, but will serve you ill as a duchess. I do not wish to be arrogant. There is considerable territory between modesty and arrogance, child. Learn to occupy it. Sebastian watched these lessons with a mixture of amusement and concern, pulling Arabella aside whenever he felt his grandmother was pressing too hard. "You do not need to become someone else," he told her one evening, finding her in the library where she had retreated to escape another lecture on the proper management of household staff. "My grandmother means well, but she sometimes forgets that the woman I love is already perfect. I am far from perfect. You are perfect for me. That is all that matters." He drew her into his arms, and she melted against him as she had learned to do, finding comfort in his solid presence. "If you wish to serve dinner at unconventional times, or address the servants by their Christian names, or read novels in the garden instead of paying calls on tedious neighbours, you may do so. You will be the Duchess of Thornbury. You may set whatever standards you choose. Your grandmother would disagree. My grandmother has gotten her way in nearly everything. She can yield in this." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Promise me you will not lose yourself in becoming what you think I need. What I need is you, Arabella, exactly as you are." She tried to remember those words as the wedding approached, as the estate filled with preparations and the guest list, despite Sebastian's wishes for intimacy, grew to include a handful of his closest friends, and what remained of her own distant family. A cousin she barely remembered arrived from Somerset, tearfully grateful to see that at least one member of the Thornton family had escaped their father's shadow of disgrace. An elderly aunt materialized from Yorkshire, declaring that she had always known Arabella was destined for great things, and would certainly have helped her years ago if only she had known of her circumstances. "Vultures," Sebastian muttered, watching the aunt ingratiate herself with every wealthy guest. "They ignored you when you needed them, and now swarm to share in your good fortune. Let them swarm. They cannot touch me any more." Arabella watched her aunt with something approaching pity. "She is lonely and poor and frightened of dying in obscurity. If my marriage provides her with a few months of reflected glory, what harm does it do?" Sebastian looked at her with an expression she was learning to recognize wonder, mixed with something deeper. "You are remarkable, do you know that? Anyone else would be bitter. I was bitter for a long time, but bitterness is exhausting, and I find I have better uses for my energy now." The wedding took place on a crisp December morning, 2 months after the night that had changed everything. True to Sebastian's wishes, they exchanged their vows in the ruined chapel, surrounded only by those who truly mattered: the dowager, Sebastian's closest friend from university, Arabella's overwhelmed cousin, and a handful of estate staff who had become family over the years. Arabella wore a gown of ivory silk that the modiste had declared her masterpiece, simple and elegant, and utterly unlike the elaborate confections fashionable in London. Her copper hair was woven with winter jasmine from the Thornbury gardens. Her mother's pearls, the only jewellery her father had not managed to gamble away, hung warm against her throat. Sebastian stood before the broken altar in his finest coat, his grey eyes never leaving her face as she walked toward him through the wildflowers that somehow still bloomed despite the season. Later, Arabella would learn that he had ordered the gardeners to cultivate winter-blooming varieties specifically for this day, a romantic gesture so unlike the cold Duke of reputation that it made her heart ache with love for the man he was becoming. "Dearly beloved," the village priest began, his voice echoing off ancient stones and carrying up to the open sky, "we are gathered here in the sight of God." The words of the ceremony washed over Arabella like music, familiar and sacred, and transformed by the context into something entirely new. She had attended weddings before as a girl, before her father's disgrace, dressed in her finest and watching from the family pew. But she had never stood at the altar herself, never felt the weight of vows settling around her like a mantle. I, Sebastian Arthur James Ashworth, Duke of Thornbury, take thee, Arabella Grace Thornton. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as they held hers. This man, this cold, proud, wounded man, was giving himself to her with a vulnerability that took her breath away. The Ice Duke, society called him, but there was no ice in his eyes now. Only warmth and hope, and a love so fierce it seemed to burn. I, Arabella Grace Thornton, take thee, Sebastian Arthur James Ashworth. Her own voice did not waver. The years of making herself invisible, of suppressing her emotions, of presenting a calm facade to the world, those skills served her now, allowing her to speak the most important words of her life with the clarity they deserved. When the priest pronounced them man and wife, Sebastian kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to the dowager's eyes, though she would later deny it vehemently. "I love you," he murmured against her lips, too soft for anyone else to hear. "I love you, Arabella Ashworth, Duchess of Thornbury. I love you, and I will spend every day of my life making certain you never doubt it." 7 years later, summer lay upon Thornbury like a blessing, the gardens blooming in riotous profusion, the lawns stretching green and velvet soft under the afternoon sun. From her seat on the terrace, Arabella watched 3 copper-haired children race across the grass in pursuit of a laughing spaniel, their shrieks of delight carrying on the warm breeze. "Edmund, do not pull your sister's hair. Charlotte, leave the dog's tail alone. And for heaven's sake, someone catch James before he falls into the fountain again." The children ignored her completely, as children were wont to do on perfect summer afternoons. Arabella shook her head with fond exasperation and returned her attention to the letter in her lap, a report from the London house regarding preparations for their arrival next month. The season awaited, with all its obligations and complications, but for now she was content to bask in the peace of Thornbury and let the city's demands remain distant concerns. "You are looking very Duchess-like this afternoon." Sebastian's voice came from behind her, warm with amusement. "Surveying your domain with an air of benevolent authority. My grandmother would be proud." "Your grandmother is the one who insisted I develop what she called the ducal glare. I have been practicing on the children." Arabella tilted her face up for his kiss, a casual intimacy that still sent sparks through her veins after 7 years of marriage. "Though I fear they are immune." "They are terrors, every one of them. I cannot imagine where they get it from. Certainly not from their father, who has never terrorized anyone in his life." "I terrorized Lady Blackmore rather effectively, as I recall." Sebastian settled into the chair beside her, stretching his long legs out with the ease of a man entirely at home in his world. "I saw her at Whitfield's ball last spring. She actually crossed the room to avoid speaking to me." Poor Lady Blackmore. Though I understand Lady Georgiana is quite happy with her Mr. Henderson. Deliriously happy, according to rumour. 4 children and a modest estate in Hertfordshire, and not a single regret for the title that got away. Sebastian's hand found hers, intertwining their fingers with the absent familiarity of long habit. "Speaking of children, I believe our youngest has found the fountain." Arabella followed his gaze and sighed. 3-year-old James sat in the shallow basin of the ornamental fountain, soaked to the skin and beaming with triumph, while his older siblings looked on with expressions torn between horror and admiration. "I told Nurse he would find a way. That child is part fish. He is determined, like his mother. Charlotte has your stubbornness as well, though she masks it with her grandmother's tactical mind. Only Edmund seems to have inherited my more cautious nature. Edmund is 7 years old, and has already informed me that he intends to reform Parliament when he comes of age. I would not call that cautious. Ambitious, perhaps, but he plans his ambitions carefully. Sebastian's voice held paternal pride he no longer tried to hide. He will make an excellent duke some day. Not for many years yet, God willing. Not for many years. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the nursemaid hurry across the lawn to retrieve the waterlogged James, while Edmund lectured his younger siblings on the dangers of fountain-related misbehaviour. The spaniel, having escaped Charlotte's attentions, flopped contentedly in a patch of sun, apparently exhausted by the afternoon's adventures. "I received a letter from your cousin this morning," Sebastian said eventually. "She wishes to visit next month." "Catherine? How unexpected. I thought she was firmly established in Bath." "She has apparently found the waters disagreeable, and the society insufficiently elevated." His voice held a trace of the old, aristocratic dryness that had once masked his emotions, but now served merely as gentle humour. "She hopes that a visit to her illustrious relations might restore her spirits." "And her prospects, no doubt. No doubt." Sebastian squeezed her hand. "You need not invite her if you prefer not to. The woman spent years ignoring your existence." "She was afraid of my father's disgrace tainting her by association. I cannot entirely blame her for that." Arabella considered the letter that awaited response on her writing desk. "Let her come. Perhaps being useful to her will be its own reward, and perhaps she has genuinely changed. Either way, I find I have no anger left to spare for old grievances." "You are too forgiving. I am precisely forgiving enough. Anger takes energy, and I prefer to spend mine on people who matter." She turned to look at him, drinking in the familiar planes of his face, the grey eyes that had once seemed so cold, and now held only warmth, the dark hair now threaded liberally with silver, the lines around his mouth that came from smiling far more often than the young Duke of Thornbury had ever smiled. "On you, on our children, on this life we have built together. It is a good life, is it not?" His voice held wonder, as though even after 7 years he could not quite believe his fortune. "Better than I ever imagined possible. Better than I dared to dream." A commotion from the far end of the terrace drew their attention. Augusta the Dowager, though Arabella had long since ceased to think of her as such, emerged from the house in her chair, pushed by her long-suffering attendant, her white hair gleaming in the sunlight, and her dark eyes as sharp as ever, despite her 80 years. "There you are." Her voice carried with the authority of decades. "Edmund, come here at once. I wish to hear you recite the poem you have been learning, and someone fetch James out of that fountain before he catches his death." Edmund obediently abandoned his siblings and hurried to his great-grandmother's side, straightening his spine and clasping his hands behind his back with the formality of a much older child. Augusta nodded approval at his bearing and gestured for him to begin. "I wandered lonely as a cloud," Edmund recited, his clear voice carrying across the lawn, "that floats on high o'er vales and hills." Arabella listened with half an ear, her attention caught by the scene before her. Her son performing for a great-grandmother who adored him, her daughter attempting to teach the spaniel to shake hands, her youngest being wrapped in towels by a scolding nursemaid, while he giggled with unrepentant joy. Sebastian beside her, his hand warm in hers, his presence the steady centre around which her entire world revolved. "What are you thinking?" Sebastian's quiet voice pulled her from her reverie. "I am thinking that I was invisible for so long. So many years of trying not to be seen, not to take up space, not to want things I was told I could never have." She turned to face him fully, and the love in her eyes made his breath catch, as it had on their wedding day, as it still did every morning when he woke beside her. And now I am the Duchess of Thornbury, with 3 beautiful children and a husband who loves me, and a life I could never have imagined. I am thinking about how strange it
is the way happiness arrives, not in the shape we expect, but in the shape we need. You deserved this happiness. You always did. Perhaps. But deserving is not the same as receiving. So many people deserve joy and never find it. She glanced toward the dowager, who was listening to Edmund's recitation with an expression of fierce pride. I was lucky. I had someone who saw me when I could not see myself, who believed in me when I had forgotten how to believe. I had you. You had yourself. Sebastian lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to her fingers. I merely provided the opportunity. Everything you have become, everything you have achieved, that was always inside you, Arabella, waiting for the moment when you would finally believe it. The recitation ended to enthusiastic applause from the gathered family. James, having escaped his towels, made a break for the fountain again before being caught by his father, who swung the squealing child up onto his shoulders and pretended to threaten dumping him back into the water. Charlotte immediately demanded the same treatment, while Edmund watched with the dignified disapproval of an heir who considered such antics beneath him. "Papa is going to drop James in the fountain," Charlotte informed Arabella solemnly. "I heard him say so. Papa is teasing. He would never drop any of you anywhere. He dropped Edmund in the hay wagon last summer. That was an accident. Edmund says Papa did it on purpose because Edmund called him old. Edmund should not call his father old, and Papa should not drop anyone in hay wagons." Arabella tried to maintain a stern expression, but felt her lips twitching. "Both of them are incorrigible." "What does incorrigible mean?" "It means impossible to improve. Like you, my darling, when you put frogs in cook's soup pot." Charlotte's eyes widened with unconvincing innocence. "I was helping. Grandmother said frogs are a French delicacy." "Grandmother says many things that should not be taken as instruction." Arabella pulled her daughter close and breathed in the scent of sunshine and grass and childhood. "Go rescue your father from your brother. I believe James is attempting to remove Papa's cravat." Charlotte ran off, her laughter trailing behind her like ribbons, and Arabella watched her family with a heart so full it felt like it might overflow. Sebastian had indeed lost his cravat to James's determined fingers, and was now engaged in a mock battle with all 3 children, his dignity thoroughly sacrificed to paternal love. Augusta wheeled herself closer, her attendant retreating at a subtle gesture. The old woman's eyes moved from Arabella to the scene on the lawn, and something in her expression softened into satisfaction, so complete it seemed to ease years from her face. "I told you," Augusta said, her voice quiet enough that only Arabella could hear. "I told you he would be happy, that you both would be. You did." Arabella reached out and took the dowager's fragile hand, marveling at how familiar the gesture had become over the years, how this formidable woman had transformed from employer to mentor to beloved grandmother. "You saw what neither of us could see. You believed when we had both forgotten how. That is what family does." Augusta's grip tightened briefly before releasing. "We see for each other when our own vision fails. We hold hope for each other when despair seems easier. We refuse to give up, even when those we love have given up on themselves." Her dark eyes, still sharp despite their age, held Arabella's with an intensity that demanded truth. "You have been everything I hoped for, Arabella. Everything and more. My grandson is transformed. My great-grandchildren are thriving. And this family, this legacy I have devoted my life to protecting, is in the best possible hands. Augusta, I am not being morbid, merely honest.
I am 80 years old, child. I have outlived everyone I expected to outlive, and a fair number I did not. Whatever time remains to me, I will spend it watching what you have built together, and knowing that when I am gone, it will continue to grow. You have many years left. Perhaps, perhaps not. Either way, I am content. Augusta's gaze returned to the lawn, where Sebastian had finally been brought down by the combined assault of all three children, and was now lying in the grass while they climbed over him like puppies over a patient hound. I am content, Arabella. That is a gift I never expected to receive. The afternoon mellowed toward evening, the light growing golden and soft, the shadows lengthening across the lawn. The children were eventually captured by their nursemaids and carried off for baths and supper, their protests echoing through the manor's halls. Augusta retired to her rooms, claiming fatigue but actually, Arabella suspected, wanting to allow the young people their privacy. Sebastian found Arabella in the garden, standing in the spot where he had proposed 7 years ago, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and amber. "There you are." He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "I have been looking for you." I needed a moment of quiet. I love our children desperately, but they are exhausting. They are magnificent terrors. I cannot imagine where they get their energy. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "What are you thinking about, standing here alone?" "I am thinking about the girl who arrived at Thornbury 8 years ago with nothing but a single trunk and a broken heart. Thinking about how frightened she was, how certain that her life was over, how impossible it would have seemed to imagine. This." She gestured at the garden, the manor glowing warm in the evening light, the life they had built together. All of this. That girl was stronger than she knew. That girl had forgotten what strength even felt like. She had been told so many times that she was worthless, that she had begun to believe it. Arabella turned in his arms, facing him, memorizing the face she knew better than her own. "You helped me remember. You and your grandmother, and this place, and the life we have created. You helped me see myself as someone worthy of love. You were always worthy. You simply needed someone stubborn enough to convince you." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the path of a tear she had not realized she was shedding. "I look at you now, and I see the woman I fell in love with, but also so much more. You have grown into your power, Arabella. You command this household, this estate, this family, with an authority that would make my grandmother jealous if she were not so proud. I learned from the best. You learned from yourself. We merely provided the space for you to discover what was already there." The sunset deepened around them, painting the world in colors that seemed too beautiful to be real. Somewhere in the house, Arabella could hear the faint sounds of children's voices, their children, their legacy, their future taking shape with every passing day. "I love you," she said, the words as true and necessary as breathing. "I have loved you since before I knew what love meant, and I will love you long after words fail me entirely. And I love you." He kissed her, soft and deep and full of promise. "I love you, Arabella Ashworth, Duchess of Thornbury, mother of my children, partner of my heart. I love you, and I thank God every day for a grandmother who was wise enough to see what I could not." They stood together in the garden as the stars began to emerge. Two people who had found in each other the courage to hope, the strength to heal, and the love to build a life neither had dared to dream of. Behind them, the manor's windows glowed with warmth and light. Before them, the future stretched out like an undiscovered country, full of possibility. Arabella leaned into her husband's embrace and smiled. She had been invisible once, a ghost moving through a world that did not see her. But now she was seen, truly seen, wholly known, completely loved, and the joy of it still took her breath away, even after all these years. The dowager had been right, as the dowager always was. Some people needed to be chosen before they could choose themselves. Some people needed someone to believe in them before they could believe in themselves. And some loves, against all odds and expectations, were simply meant to be.